For me, just a good chance to give back, a good chance to help.
Seattle's legendary Rain Man is looking for a slam dunk in the lucrative cannabis industry.
I knew that there wasn't any black owners in Seattle.
And your receipt and your bag.
That might soon change in Washington state with a new social equity in cannabis task force.
African American businesses mean jobs for African Americans.
How would a new cannabis business equity framework help reverse the impact of the war on drugs?
We're just asking to rebuild the Black community.
Our panel of experts weighs in.
How much does it cost to save Black lives in Washington state?
How can we build generational wealth?
Working towards racial justice through new opportunities in the multi-billion-dollar marijuana industry. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Washington was one of the first states in the U.S. to legalize the retail sale of marijuana in 2012. But critics say it's way behind when it comes to dealing with issues of racial inequity related to cannabis. Many African Americans trying to become licensed sellers say they've been shut out, and studies show blacks continue to be arrested more often than whites for marijuana-related crimes. But working to improve cannabis equity is a challenge, with financial, legal, and racial concerns all indicating an uncertain path ahead. The grand opening of Shawn Kemp's Cannabis at First and Denny was full of all the hoopla you'd expect surrounding a Seattle Sonics icon. But the real slam dunk for Kemp isn't really lines around the block for his store. It's his effort to remove the stigma around marijuana.
When I played basketball, a lot of guys I played with were getting in trouble for marijuana. I've been in trouble for marijuana. Things have changed a little bit.
One big change? Retail marijuana is now legal in Washington and 14 other states, plus the District of Columbia.
And your receipt and your bag.
NBA legend Payton even has his own marijuana strain, and he's eager to give a boost to his old teammate.
When he wanted me to do something, or he wanted me to open up something, I support him. And that's what it is. I played with him so many years. That's why we call it the Glove and Rain Man.
Kemp, who is proud to have a stake in his namesake store near the Space Needle, also wants to help his community, hiring and inspiring people of all races to get involved in this multi-billion-dollar industry.
There's ways that this can help a lot of different people, but we're just going to try to be part of it.
But beyond Kemp's larger-than-life impact on this Seattle business, there's a problem.
African Americans are feeling like they're being left out of this industry.
Ollie Garrett is on the State Liquor and Cannabis Board and is well aware Kemp, with his 5% stake, is the only black owner of any of the nearly 50 licensed marijuana outlets in Seattle.
We know that is not reflective of the businesses that were operating before legalization.
City of Seattle Finance and Administrative Services, along with the state legislature, are working to make the cannabis system more racially equitable, but they're up against some big challenges.
But when it comes to the cannabis industry, that has always been something that African Americans have gone to jail for.
Underlying the business equity concerns, studies show even after legalization, black people are 4 times more likely than whites to be arrested on marijuana charges, like public consumption.
And so I'm, to be honest, quite frustrated.
State House Bill 2870, signed into law in March of this year, establishes a marijuana social equity program to issue previously forfeited retailer licenses to eligible applicants adversely impacted by marijuana prohibition laws.
That's not social equity.
But critics say making licenses available is just one piece of the problem, and Ollie Garrett knows it.
The number one thing you needed to have was capital.
Garrett says would-be black owners didn't have investors and big money to get involved in the retail cannabis industry when it launched in 2012. They also didn't have the legal and technical knowledge on how to apply for a license either, so they were hindered from the start.
So it was a lot of technical assistance that needed to have gone along with the application process, and that we missed out on those opportunities to do that.
We hope to be an incubator of sorts.
For now, Shawn Kemp is leaning on industry veteran Ramsey Hamide, a majority owner of Shawn Kemp's Cannabis, to show him the ropes as they open 4 more stores and offer help to other prospective business owners of color, charting their way into an industry fraught with racial, legal, and financial challenges.
This is going to be kind of the proof of concept for many big things to come.
This one shop in Seattle is not the solution to the problem of cannabis inequity. But Shawn Kemp is hoping he can rise to the occasion once again and at least start to even the score.
We've had marijuana in our community for so long, but we haven't reaped the benefits of having marijuana in our community. So I think it's time that those things change.
And joining us to discuss this topic, we have with us Cherie MacLeod. She's the Cannabis Program Coordinator at the City of Seattle's Finance and Administrative Services. She also co-leads the city's Racial Equity in Cannabis Licensing Project. We also have with us Joy Hollingsworth. She is owner of Hollingsworth Cannabis, the first licensed Black-owned and operated cannabis farm in Washington. And finally, Paula Sardinas. She is a commissioner on the Washington State Commission on African American Affairs and also co-chair of the state's new Social Equity in Cannabis Taskforce. Cherie, let me start with you here. We saw a lot of excitement here in Seattle over Shawn Kemp's Cannabis opening at the end of October there. So Shawn's a 5% owner, according to the state, and the only owner in Seattle who identifies as Black or African American. Give us a broad overview on why that's the case.
So prior to legalization, when we had the medical dispensaries here in Seattle, we know we had more representation of our demographics here in the city. I met several of the owners of the dispensaries, have been made aware of others. It was just the licensing process. The initial process only allowed for 21 licenses. I believe there were well over 100 applications, which led to a lottery. So a lot of folks did not have the opportunity to get in. And then in the second round, which was to allow medical to transition to recreational, again, many of our former people of color who were also dispensary owners were left out of the opportunity.
Got it. Joy, let me get a business perspective from you on this. How difficult was it for you, an African-American person, to get involved in this industry and stay in this industry? I brought up the Shawn Kemp story in Seattle, but the fact is there are not that many owners who identify as Black, statewide or nationwide.
Yeah, absolutely. The numbers on that, Brian, is about 1% of the ownership across the country. So Seattle and the state of Washington fall in line with that. There are a lot of barriers that come into play. When you look at the medical market before 502, which is the recreational cannabis initiative that passed, there were more Black owners in that medical market than there are today right now in the 502 market. A lot of those people had dispensaries, they built their livelihood on it, they gave back to their community. And when 502 hit, there were a ton of barriers that were put in place, whether it was paperwork, there was a lot of laws and regulation. It was just really cumbersome. And it was the first time the state had ever done anything like this. And so the difficulty was a lot of people were not able to transfer over into the recreational market, even though some of them were promised that with the hopes that this was going to happen. And we've seen a lot of people that look like myself who have been in the industry and have been displaced by a lot of the laws and regulations. So it's just a really challenging time in the industry.
Yeah. And Paul, let me bring you in here. Our state, of course, one of the first in the U.S. to legalize the retail sale of marijuana through I-502. But it really does seem to be behind when it comes to this whole issue of cannabis equity. You've worked in this field for many years. Why do you think it's taken so long for our state to act on this equity issue? And also, what are some of the main concerns you have about this issue overall?
Great question, Brian. I think it's clear that it wasn't a priority. When you look at the LCB and the agencies tasked with overseeing the policy, they don't have anyone on their staff that's trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so how can you tackle an issue of structural racism and inequity in cannabis when you don't actually understand it? I think if they looked at the access points and saw the number of African Americans that they had displaced, and if they had made that a priority and had equity be the concentric circle of legalization, we wouldn't be in the spot that we're in 2020. And so I think as we look at dismantling these barriers of structural racism, we have to ask ourselves, what does an equitable cannabis system look like? We can look at California, Massachusetts, and Illinois, and no one has been able to get social equity right. So when I look at Washington, we are uniquely positioned, having seen California, Massachusetts, and now Illinois go before us, to learn from the mistakes that they've made and to basically center community. Like Joy said, we need to look at this is not just a question of whether or not it generates generational wealth. It's what can those opportunities do to help us improve and build back a more prosperous Black community. Yeah. So as chair of the task force, that's my goal, bringing a racial equity lens to the matter and making sure that we center the Black community.
Okay, well, Paula, let me stick with you here. I want to talk about House Bill 2870, which the governor signed into law back in March. This is a measure that makes cannabis retail licenses that have been canceled or revoked available to people who have been adversely affected by marijuana prohibition. It also sets up a grant fund for people who might need technical training to make this happen with licenses. How do you think this approach from the state is going to work?
First of all, it was phenomenal that we were able to get a piece of legislation done in 42 days, with COVID kind of being the backdrop. Even more amazing that we were able to hold on to the appropriation. So we do want to say thank you to the Governor and Department of Commerce. But I think it's like building a car. It's a first step. There are a lot of things that as we get into the task force work, that we're realizing that we failed to get in that legislation. So we're hoping to have a cleanup bill this session, something coming out of the Senate and the House. And we need to look at some of the other parameters, like what is a disparate impact and how do we properly define it? I think the bill does a poor job of describing that. I think working with people like Cherie at the city of Seattle and Gloria at the city of Tacoma, we realize that people have changed. Through gentrification, they've been displaced. So a person who might have had a disparate impact 5 years ago may not be in Seattle, they might be in Burien today. So I'm looking forward to treating 2870 as a vehicle and a mechanism to social equity, but it's not by any means the finished product. There's still work to do. And I think we need now more than ever, more weigh-in from the community about how do we go forward to craft the most progressive social equity program in the nation.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of work still ahead with this, but Joy, let me bring you in. Your thoughts on this. Is this House bill the right approach for the state, for your business, for others trying to get into the business? What do you think?
Absolutely. I think what Paula said was really, really important. And I also want to highlight that, we've worked on this with Cherie, with Paula. Like, this was an inclusive effort here. And our state is really, really lucky to have people like Paula and Cherie and other officials who really care about social equity and want to get it right. And what's really good to highlight is, the bill, a lot of people might have said certain things about it, but like Paula said, it's a vehicle for us to get to a certain point. I'm excited about what the city of Seattle has brewing up and some of those programs, which I'm sure Cherie will share a little bit more about what their direction is with their Department Office of Economic Development, but also us being used as a blueprint for other states across the country to not only when they talk about legalizing cannabis, but also attaching a social equity clause in that bill when they're passing it and thinking about recreational. When you look at Washington State, Colorado, California, all these states, they didn't have a social equity piece attached to their actual legislation with those bills with recreational cannabis. And so when we talk about this, social equity needs to be in the conversation of legalizing when you're looking at different states in those bills.
Very good point. Cherie, let me bring in here. You work for the city of Seattle, of course, but you also serve on the state's task force on this issue. How is the city going to work with the state on this issue? Is it a deal where a certain number of licenses are dedicated to Seattle? I guess that's one question. And how do you determine who gets one of these licenses through an equity program?
Hey, Brian, thank you for the question. So the details have not been worked out yet, but the way House Bill 2870 is written, it discusses the allocation of licenses that have been revoked, taken back in some way. And at this time, there's one license that was canceled a couple of years ago here in Seattle. So we know we have that, and I believe there'll be a second. So part of the work of the task force is to actually take a look, is that going to be enough? And it may be, the task force will likely recommend some form of allocation to allow the cities or the municipalities and counties that want equity applicants to be able to, come into those jurisdictions. So at this time, we don't know the numbers for certain. I believe there are 35 of those revoked or canceled licenses statewide. How those will be allocated, we just don't know yet. So the city, we've had a racial equity toolkit project on cannabis licensing now for 2.5 years. Been working with Joy, working with Paula on it, and partnering with them has helped us on our project. I believe Joy mentioned that we do plan on working with the Office of Economic Development, because part of this piece, it's not about just giving out licenses, is how can we ensure that the businesses are successful, get their foot in the door, be able to sustain against an industry that's been operating now for 6 years.
Right.
So it's going to be difficult to come in and then reinvesting in the community. That's why it's so important for us to work with OED, because they already do work with the businesses in the communities. So how we can do more work around that, workforce development.
Sure.
There's many pieces to this that we'd like to do.
Well, let me bring in a business voice here, and Joy, I'll go back to you here. This whole question of where to get capital to invest in a cannabis business is a challenge for anybody, perhaps even more so for people of color. I want to talk about the money lending issues that go on with cannabis. This is still a federally illegal drug. Let us know how you've been able to manage it.
Yeah, great question, Brian. There's different options out there. You can't go to a traditional bank and get a loan to start this business, whether it's a credit union or bank. That's just out of the question. Us personally, we know that we're different in a lot of ways because we were able to take my dad's retirement funds and pried it out of his hands. But he bet on his kids and bet on himself to be able to do what we have done. But we know that a lot of people are not in that position to be able to make that investment. So, there are different ways. You get hard money. You can't get it from banks. A lot of the people that were in the medical market, they had savings. They had saved up a lot of money. And some of them, when they tried to transition over, they spent a lot of those monies, whether it was on rent for a certain place, it was on licensing fees, whether it was on getting a lawyer, tax accountant, you name it, they spent their livelihood. A lot of people put up their houses. And I know Paula can go into more with that because she works with a lot of clients who had put in their entire investment into this system, and they were not able to benefit from it. So that's where we got started with our funding.
Got it. Well, Paula, let me bring in here. I'm trying to figure out what the state should do, the city should do, et cetera, to help Black business owners access the capital they need here. How big of a barrier is money, in your opinion?
It's huge. If you look at 2018, I passed Senate Bill 5928, which basically gave access to credit unions without the fear of prosecution to banking. So you've got OB Credit Union, you've got Salal in Seattle, and you've got Numerica that's out in Eastern Washington. When you look at what they've been able to do, Numerica has an entire cannabis treasury suite within their financial institution as credit unions. And so they have a little bit more leeway to work with some of the products. And I know that they're trying to see how we go forward. But when you say, how can the state be an integral partner in this work? Well, we know all the time that we allocate money to things that we care about. I jokingly say that a couple of years ago, we allocated $1.1 billion to save the orcas. How much does it cost to save Black lives in Washington state? So what I'd like to see is some sort of a BIPOC stimulus plan where the dollars can be used for all businesses, ancillary included. So if you'd like to invest those dollars in cannabis, the state should be underwriting that from the dedicated marijuana fund, or you could invest that in opening up a Chick-fil-A in another business. I think we've got to start looking at cannabis like any other Black business. What do we need? We need a BIPOC stimulus package because we've got the greatest disparate impact, and we need to look at those dollars and say, how can we invest in your future today, and how do those dollars benefit you tomorrow? So on one hand, you've got some dollars that will help you as a social equity applicant, but where are the dollars to help people like Joy, people like Dwayne Dunn, people like Tamara, who's got natural blessings in Tacoma, who have labored under this very difficult system to keep their doors open? We should be doing innovation R&D dollars to keep those businesses going forward. Yeah. So you're hearing it first on the Seattle channel. I'm going to be calling for a BIPOC stimulus plan for the Black and other BIPOC community.
Okay, well, I've heard that a few times now, so I know where you're going with this one. Cherie, let's talk about dollars and cents here a little bit here too. As has been mentioned, a handful of cities, states in the U.S. have these cannabis equity programs. Portland, for example, just to the south of us, has this added sales tax at cannabis shops. The revenue goes directly towards some of these social equity programs. I know the details aren't worked out yet, but is that the right path, perhaps, for Seattle? What do you think?
So we're still trying to locate funding to both support a program to help provide grants or low interest loans. So we're still researching that, and you're correct. Portland does have a separate sales tax, but as you're probably aware, there's already a 37% marijuana excise tax plus the 10.1% sales tax applied at retail. So the city cannot add an additional tax. And we had issued a survey earlier this summer, primarily taken online, but we also had some come back on paper. And the overwhelming response was that the marijuana excise tax that the city uses should be used to help support this industry, particularly for Black ownership in cannabis. So we're still trying to identify sources.
We will see where that goes. But let me take this bigger picture if I could. And Joy, I'll start with you here. This has been a year of protest here in Seattle and around the country following the death of George Floyd. Black Lives Matter here in King County, for example, has a list of demands, including a call for racial justice, shifting more resources into community health, community capital. Where does this issue of cannabis equity fit into this larger framework of Black Lives Matter? And your thoughts?
Yeah, great question. So think about this. We know that the war on drugs disproportionately harmed the Black community. Black and brown community is where it harmed, Black people specifically. And so when we look at the disparities, we know that because of the war on drugs, what did that do? It separated the nuclear family. It created educational disparities, food insecurity, jobs, generational wealth, housing. Okay, we talk about gentrification in the Central District. Well, that was one of the hotspots where police targeted Black people on corners and arresting them for nonviolent drug offenses. Okay, so when we look at that, we see all these things happening. Everything that a lot of the advocacy groups are advocating for, and I know other people have been doing work as well. We're just asking to rebuild the Black community, to build that up, generational wealth. I know our family wants to use our platform and spotlight about food security within the Black BIPOC community because of COVID and just having access to fresh fruits and vegetables. We've been using our platform a lot to shed light on that. So, you know, agree with a lot of the messaging there in terms of, you know, just trying to get an investment back into the Black community. I think that's huge. And when we talk about cannabis and social equity, besides it being licensed to people to get licenses, so ownership, that's what we're talking about. We started talking about Shawn Kemp, that 5% ownership. Also, too, people being able to start small businesses from this cannabis social equity fund. If you want to start a website, you should be able to apply for a grant. If you want to be a lawyer and get more information about cannabis, you should be able to go ahead and apply for a grant so you can go to school for that. So we're talking about a broader collective piece. A lot of places like California, Oregon, Illinois, they don't have a lot of those laws specifically for that. We want to be able to create those programs here in Washington State.
Okay, Paul, I'll head to you here. You've been working with this issue for some time. I know there's a lot of different equity pieces involved here, including equity when it comes to how white people, Black people are arrested for marijuana offenses. This is a big, big issue here, and I wanted your thoughts on this. Is this the year that maybe we can make some progress on this? I know you've been working on this for a long time.
I think it is. I think we have an opportunity here. And the question is, you know, an opportunity is not what is given, it's what you make of it. We have felt the weight of oppression and those boots in our necks for 401 years. And so what I would say to our leadership in the Washington State Legislature, which is Democrat controlled, to the Attorney General, who's a Democrat, to the Governor, who's a Democrat, we're asking for you to be our allies and our partners in equity. We're not asking for a handout, we're asking for a hand up. How can you partner with us in the year of tumultuous change to say that Washington's values are centered around equity and equality, and that Black lives matter, and they matter in policy? I think we'll see that based on the legislation that we'll start seeing next month in the legislative session, whether or not people mean what they say when they're running for office, or if it's just a good political slogan and jargons. I always tell people, I don't care what you say, I look at what you do. And I think the country is going to be looking at the morals and the values of Washington State, a progressive state that can go first and be a leader. We're not California. We are not Illinois. We're not Massachusetts. We have an opportunity here to create something that will change the life and the trajectory for Black and African American Washingtonians, but also to model for the nation. And so I'm like, let's do it.
Yeah. Well, Cherie, let me bring you in here because Seattle city leaders and the council, the mayor's office too, they've been talking a lot about racial equity, getting money into BIPOC communities here in this budget session that just wrapped up here. Where does achieving cannabis equity fit into this overall effort by the city, trying to walk the talk in this phrase, Black Lives Matter?
So that was actually one of our department director's proposals for creating more inclusion and equity in cannabis. That was proposed up to the mayor's office a few months ago. It really does fall into this, and we've been actually looking at that because we want to also address the displacement. You know, how can, like Joy was saying, how can we build generational wealth? So much of this does fall under that. It's just they don't really talk about cannabis in that, so that would be a separate piece. But a lot of what we're trying to do and accomplish through our recommendations that we're still working on does fall into that package that has gone through.
Yeah. I know there's a lot still ahead there. We need to start wrapping up the show, so hopefully the 20-second version here with your answers, if I could. I want to talk about the Marijuana Social Equity Task Force, originally supposed to have some policy recommendations to the governor December 1st. Complications from COVID, of course, have pushed that into next year. But Paula, I wanted to ask you, this work is ongoing, but what are the main recommendations you hope ultimately make it to the governor on this issue?
Ultimately, we want to see a recommendation for vertical integration, more licenses in retail, more licenses in producer processor, and ultimately we want consumption lounges and delivery licenses. We think having a broad sweeping approach to this is the path to generational wealth.
Got it. Cherie, some final thoughts from you here. Is the city of Seattle going to be doing its own thing here before the state acts, or what's your next thoughts here?
We do want to align with the state, so we're likely to have our own program in addition to what the state comes out with.
Got it. Okay, I know there's a lot still ahead there for the city to do. Joy, final thoughts here, recommendations, warnings, however you want to put it, to the state and city as we move ahead with this idea of cannabis equity.
We're looking forward to an inclusive program that also offers people an ownership stake in the industry and also access to ancillary businesses as well, and then also potentially redirecting some of those tax dollars into a BIPOC stimulus as well. So looking forward to building that program, helping, assisting, whatever we can do, and watching this program grow big time.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for your input, and we will be right back. What are people on social media saying about this issue? One person writes, without social equity in the cannabis industry, people of color will continue being shut out of an exciting economic opportunity that has, in large part, been built with their hands. Another writes, social equity is a worthy goal, but can we first focus on releasing people serving egregious sentences in federal prison for cannabis? We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, rent relief for the thousands who have fallen behind on their payments during the pandemic. The state's eviction ban expires at the end of the year, and housing advocates are warning about a spike in homelessness unless the moratorium is extended. Landlords are pushing back. We'll bring you the latest next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.